morning, IACA members and guests. Thank you for coming on to this webinar today regarding the Draft Australian Standard AS4970, Protection of Trees on Development Sites. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we're meeting on and acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging. The draft standard has been out for public comment for a few weeks now, and the public comment is open until the 1st of August. Peter Castor is IACA's representative on the committee, and so he will be able to give us a bit of an overview of the process and who has been involved and possibly how some of the decisions and changes have come about. He does have a confidentiality agreement in place about what discussions and decisions go on within the committee meetings and communications, so there may be things that he can't answer directly, but may be able to give some background information and his own perspective on this proposed standard and the existing standard and things like that. And as I said, I welcome comments, questions, expertise throughout the webinar because you've all got valuable insights and work with the standard probably quite regularly. So a bit of an overview of the Australian Standards Review process, which I've gleaned from their website, which is not necessarily how it happens in practice, but IACA is a nominating organisation, and at some point in the past we've nominated our primary contact to be Peter Castor. I believe that organisations can have more than one, but there are limited positions on the committee, so it depends how many spaces there are. And people can self-nominate, or IACA can invite people to be nominated. There's also apparently a sharing of committee drafts program, where during that draft development, allocated people can review the drafts before this comment period, but that doesn't seem to have happened in this case, but it does seem like it would have been worthwhile during the development. And so yeah, the our representative Peter Castor is there to present the collective viewpoint of IACA, so your input is valuable. Maybe I will pass over to Peter now to give a bit more information about how the standard review was done and who was involved, and any other background you can add.
Thank you, Jackie. Yeah, given we've only got an hour or so, I'll just quickly give a bit of a background to how the review committee got to this draft. So I'll just run through the people who were on the original EV18, that's agriculture, that's the group within standards. So we had Kane Holdsworth from AILA, Cameron Ryder was representing TreeNet, Craig Hinton representing ARB Australia, Jan Allen was representing Institute of Horticulture. We had Jean Russo as an architect, Mark Hartley from ARB Australia as well, who ended up he volunteered to chair the meetings. Mark Tolka from Western Sydney University, Matthew Gibson from the Utility Arborists Association of Australia, I think he works for Essential Energy. Myself, Ross Clark representing Local Government Association, and Stephen Livesley from the University of Melbourne. Not all those people actually attended any of the meetings. The main group in the end was Mark Hartley, myself, Kane Holdsworth from AILA. Craig Hinton attended some of them. Stephen Livesley and Mark Jolka from Western Sydney Uni. So Ross Clark didn't represent at all. We did have Lindsay Field representing the local government association, yes, and he had to leave and was replaced by Kieran O'Neill at one stage. He only attended one meeting. So it was a little bit of the group shrunk very quickly, and it was just a core group of about 5 of us who actually got through. I think there were 5 meetings in all. So what else can I say in the beginning? Standards editing committee went through the document quite early. I think at the second meeting they came up with a draft that we were working on, which brought the standard in line with other Australian standards in terms of formatting, use of language, should and shall, and things like that. So there was a draft that came up quite early out of the editing committee at standards, and we worked around that. So that was quite useful. I think, Jackie, do you want me to go through some of the main changes now, or do you want to do that as we progress? If you've got that in your slideshow, just jump straight to some of the main changes in the document.
Yeah, I think if you go through some of the main ones that you know of that are probably going to stand out the most, okay. I can put my slide up at the same time.
Yeah, I've just got a few key things written down here. I could just quickly run through them. So probably in order of priority for discussion might be that the 10% major minor encroachment threshold has been moved to 20%. We can talk about that in a moment, about the reasons why that's been suggested. The confusion about tree TPZ, in that it was actually used for to define 3 different areas. That's been improved by bringing in NRA. It's not National Rifle Association, but nominal root area as the starting point. That's the circle you put on the preliminary drawings that defines 12 times trunk diameter. So I think that's a big one, because it helps to define that it's a nominal area. It's nothing to do with protection at this stage. So it's just an area that is generally regarded as required for a tree of that diameter to survive and stay viable. And we've got a tree protection area now. So the tree protection area, the TPA, that's going to be our fenced area. So when we only have TPZ to define both the starting point, the nominal area, and the fenced area, it causes constant confusion in the marketplace. So they're the 2 main terms we'll have to try and get our heads around, unless we can argue that it's not relevant. We need to go back to the old terms. But by splitting TPZ into NRA and TPA, I think that's a big improvement. Some of the other things that have come through, they've changed DBH to diameter at standard height, so DSH. There may have been some political correctness coming in, not wanting to use the word breast or something. I don't know why they changed that to standard height, but that's what it is. It's still 1.4 above grade, but that's in the definitions. The TPP is still there, the tree protection plan, but it's been linked to a tree protection specification, the TPS. So they sort of run hand in hand. So one's a drawing and one's a specification. So I think that's quite good that's been further defined. Some other things that are important that have come in is in table 1 on page 6. That's the process table. It says including updating of TPP and TPS for construction. So we've reiterated that the need for updating the tree protection plan and the recommendations or specifications for the construction period. And I think that's where a lot of our work probably falls down, that we do the DA stage work, and then during construction everything falls away because our work hasn't been updated. Also at the bottom of table 1 is a note 1, which says it's a general indication of the process only. So in our discussions with people from other states, Cameron Ryder was very good at explaining what happens in Victoria, and the actual process is very different to in New South Wales. So they do an impact assessment to begin with, say which trees have to be retained and removed, but there's no recommendations for how the construction works and how tree protection happens. It's at a completely different stage. So we try to do that all in one document at DA stage, but in Victoria it happens in distinctly 2 different stages because of the legislation there. So just to note that table 1 is only a general indication of the process. Also down at 2.2.6, if you've got your document open, it talks about the tree protection plan and tree protection specification, and it says the most current versions of these shall be included in the construction documentation. So we've reiterated again that the updating of the assessment we do at the BA stage, if you like, it's important that it gets updated for construction, and I think that's a really important improvement in this document. So I think I might just leave it at that at the moment. They're the main things that I think probably come out of this draft. It's not locked in yet. It still has to go through the public review and then a final draft. So I think I might just pass over to you, Jackie, to run some discussion points.
Okay, great. Thanks, Peter. I did have a couple of questions for you before we move on. Do you know if at this stage additional committee members could be added to represent IACA?
I think that's possible. I mean, the whole process is quite fluid, and it varied week by week. So the initial setup was quite concise, and signing this and signing that and whatever, and it just fell away as the time went on. And so I think anything's possible. The other thing I didn't mention was there was no representative from TAFE. Mm-hmm. We tried to get someone from New South Wales, and that didn't work. And then Victoria couldn't provide anybody, and that's probably a failing because they're the people who teach the report writing curriculum, and they should have been involved in this. But anyway, they're not listed. They haven't been part of it. So, but I can make an inquiry to see if another member can be included at this stage in the final wash up. The coordinator, Natalie Faber, has also moved on. There's another person who's taken over this review as well, so that probably doesn't help. But I can make an inquiry after this meeting and see if we can get another member on. Okay, thanks. Is that likely to be? Are you putting your hand up?
I can. Yep. I would be interested, seeing as I've sort of done a deep dive into the standards in the last couple of weeks. I just think, considering, as you said, people are busy and they don't have time to come to the meetings, it might be good to have more than one representative and to cover more ground and review things along the way.
I'll make an inquiry.
That'd be great. And were there any other states represented that had different ideas or different ways of doing things?
Yeah, it was mainly Victoria and New South Wales. I don't think there was anyone from outside that area. So Cameron Ryder was instrumental in trying to mould it to be more of a national document, more Victorian, because it is a little bit Sydney-centric, I suppose. With we talk about DAs and CCs, they use different terms in Victoria. So there are a few clauses in there that help the Victorian situation, but we need to be cognizant of the fact that this is meant to be a national document. So shame we didn't get other representatives, say from the Territory or WA, for example. So because every state has a different set of guiding legislation, and we have to dovetail into that. But just noting that this any Australian standard is only a guide; it's not legislated. So it's on the same legal ladder, as I understand, as the minimum industry standards documents that Australia are producing. So they're producing some quite quite lengthy documents, which, are, as I understand, of similar legal status to an Australian standard. So, you need to be aware of that as well.
Okay, thanks, Peter. I did reach out to Mark Roberts in New Zealand about how things are done in New Zealand. He was not available today. He's one of our accredited members again after a break, but he said that New Zealand doesn't have a standard of their own, but they do refer to the Australian standard and the British standard. So that's something to keep in mind, that what we put out there is affecting the New Zealand market as well.
Yeah, I think Mark's been instrumental in drafting some of the MISs as well for Arb Australia. Tree risk assessment one, I think he was involved in that, so it's quite a concise document. So yeah, he would be a good person to get on board if we could.
Okay. Danny, you've got a question, comment?
Yeah, I was just going to say, so leading up to all this, Pete knows that IACA went through a fairly lengthy process, sort of filling out table documents and agreeing on potential changes or commenting on them. And I think everything that's in there is in line with that work that was done by that subcommittee. I read through it quite thoroughly, and it seems like it's covered everything that we spoke about, Peter. And I'm pretty happy with it. I know people are weird about body parts, so like the whole thing about breast height, DBH is kind of weird, but anyway, people, it's like we're going back to the Victorian era, but anyway, so look, if that makes people happy, they're not mentioning body parts, then that's fine, it's just weird, but anyway, it's the world we live in. But that's, as long as it gets the job done, it doesn't really change anything, it's still 1.4, and if it changes things and makes people comfortable, that's fine, that's the modern era. But all the other bits, like the 20% encroachment, for a long time, we did talk about how, up to 20 was fine. I think that was covered by other researchers around the world that was, quite okay. And I guess you haven't quite eliminated the idea that, once you get 1 millimetre or 1.1% past that, Pete, that you don't actually have to rush in and do root mapping. But anyway, I know we discussed that. That doesn't seem to have been eliminated, but anyway, because I know that does a lot of damage to trees by cutting off all their fine roots, as opposed to other options that which are discussed about, piers and things like that, hand excavation. But unfortunately, I don't see it stopping the rush in direction to root map when it's not like excavated root mapping, where it's not necessary quite often. When you can do, you can do potholing and things like that. But if that could be added in to strengthen the idea of not damaging roots by unnecessary root mapping, that would be a really good idea. Yeah.
Jackie, do you mind if I just jump in on that?
Go ahead. Just
following on from Danny saying about the 20%. So I'm in support of the 20% as a threshold to begin, rather than the 10%. For a number of reasons. The main reason I think it should be 20% is that I think there's for no truly justified reason. Like, we're removing too many trees in our reports, where I think we should be given a greater chance for these trees. Even in the event that the tree declines and dies, at least the space has been left there on the site for a replacement tree. Going back even further, the 20% came out of the original committee back in, Danny was on as well, back in 2007, 2008, before the original document came out. And it was Dave Galway from Victoria who pushed hard for the 10% rather than 20. Most people in the room wanted 20% because that was sort of like the unwritten line in the sand, if you like, at that particular stage. So that's where 10% came from. The discussions way back in 2000, the lead up to the original document. The excessive amount of root mapping that's been triggered by this 10% rule as well, and in clay soils, we all know how much damage can be done, even if you're doing it with an air knife or high pressure water. It does cause damage, and on particularly large trees, it's a long way from the trunk of these trees, and we're doing a lot of damage just doing the root mapping. So and the other things that's come of light in recent years is also other guiding documents like the Apartment Design Guide out of the state government that's for apartment design, that comes up with some very small soil volumes required for trees to be retained on sites that are proposed to have apartments on them, but also documents like the Elke Hague and Simon Leek simulator. If I challenge some of you to go and have a play around on that with different sized trees and different scenarios, and it also comes up with very significantly smaller soil volumes for trees of a similar DBH that 4970 describes. So, they're two documents that have been used a lot in the courts these days as well by architects and others to say, oh, well, we want to retain this tree in this space, but it's only going to have, 40 centimetres of soil around it. And you compare that to a major encroachment under 4970, and it's like cheese and chalk. So there are other guiding documents that are being published and used widely that would suggest that the encroachments we're suggesting are fatal to a tree should possibly be re-looked at and challenged. So that's all I want to say on the 20% change that's been suggested.
Thanks, Peter. Ian, you had your hand up.
Thanks, Jack. Just on the issue of changing DBH to DSH, I'm just wondering, given that DBH is used cross discipline and internationally, I'm a bit concerned about us changing something that's got that breadth of established usage.
Yeah, I'm with you on that, Ian. I think it should stay as DBH. It's a universal measure. Sometimes it's 1.3 or 1.5, depending on which country you're in, but I think we should leave it. So,
I agree.
Yeah.
I have done some.
We all have a press.
The 1.4 meters for me is shoulder height, so DSH works quite well. I was looking into the British standards and the American documents, and the Americans are the only one that I can find with DBH in their documents. British standard 2012 uses stem diameter at 1.5. So I don't have a big issue either way. Danny, you had another question, comment?
Yeah, just to confer with what Pete was saying, I totally agree. And also Lonsdale originally talked in his great textbook about how much encroachment trees can generally tolerate as long as you compensate in other areas. And we allowed for that in the original standard by contiguous soil volumes in other directions, and which has been a key for a lot of trees to be protected. And so I just to confer everything that Peter said, that Lonsdale had said ages ago from research that they'd done in the UK that 20% was fine as long as you had contiguous soil volumes in other directions, and that's why we had it in the standard. So yeah, and I agree with Peter. I think we can protect a lot more trees. I don't know if I can't remember if we have read the document, but I can't remember if we've allowed for remediation works as well, like that we've mentioned actually remediation works to enhance the tree, but that's being protected after some encroachment. But it might be good to put that in if we haven't already mentioned remediation works. So yeah, there you go. Thank you.
Thanks, Danny. Yeah, I think the encroachments and the assessment of encroachments needs to be done in detail and justified with reasonable methods. So personally, my perspective is that the 10% is a good starting point for making sure that that encroachment is going to be tolerable by the tree. It shouldn't be a death sentence for the tree. but I'll go more into some examples for that in a minute. Hayden, you had your hand up.
Yeah, just I try to work to the 10%, but often will extend to 20% depending on the tree species and acquired knowledge. So on the species tolerances, so maybe there's a lot of knowledge in the group. So perhaps in developing this new 20% rule, that some maybe define a list of species that can tolerate it and species that can't. That's just an idea. I did want to talk about the baseline when people are suggesting root mapping. You go over 10%, you have to do root mapping. I do agree it causes a lot of damage and it's unnecessary in a lot of cases. But there's no baseline to work to on root occupancy or what you're looking at. If there's another tree or shrub there, you can't tell which root's which. So a lot of the time it is pointless. But I was going to ask, in the last couple of meetings I've been to, some general forums, they were talking about palm trees and looking at their tolerances and how you can, push in a little bit closer to them. Was that discussed?
I think the draft does have a changed approach to palm trees. I think it allows for a 2 metre TPZ, a minimum 2 metre TPZ.
That was my next thing. That's the next thing I was going to mention.
There are, there's some literature I've read talking about palm tree transplants, etc., which push it into like 60 centimetres. And I've moved a lot of palm trees in my time, just landscaping my own place, and they all survived. So I was cutting them pretty harshly, and the little golden cane palms, a couple of bungalows that were going to be removed anyway, but I decided to move them around, and yeah, they all did really well. It's pretty easy.
Yeah, I think you need to. I think that's really good insight, and just wanted to mention that seeing as the standard is a guideline, I would like to see more detailed guidance for people actually applying the standard. So what might be okay for transplanting is not necessarily what's needed for this tree to continue growing. So if you're putting a basement on 3 sides of a palm tree, 60 centimetres from the base, that's not going to be enough room, but if it's in a field, transplanted into a nice sunny field, then it will do fine.
Thanks. Can I just interrupt here? The other major assessment process that we haven't discussed yet, and what we all do, is we have a notional circle thrown on a plan, just based on 12 times trunk diameter, but the actual location of roots has to be assessed by the arborist, particularly in infill sites where you've got buildings on 3 sides already. So at some stage we come back to, well, where are the actual roots and how many of those actual roots are going to be damaged by this new application? So there's sort of an undefined, unwritten process that goes on, and that's the important bit. So sometimes, the tree's been built out on 3 sides already, and the poor guy that owns the tree doing the 4th development around it, it's difficult to know whether any roots are on the adjoining properties at all. When they were cut, whether they were cut 15, 20 years ago, should be ignored, or, because to try to justify a 10 or 20% encroachment on the actual roots that are left on that tree, you'll never get over the line. You have to be somewhat flexible, and so defining actual roots versus notional roots is a big part of it, but it's still not really defined. We tried to do that with the NRA and the TPPA, but there's still a process in between that. The fenced area is still just trying to protect this tree from the current building that's going on around it, or about to go on around it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to see more guidance in the document about that process of assessing where the roots are and then assessing what the impacts will be. Got a few people with raised hands. Shine, you were first.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, it's with regards to from the 10 to 20%. For me, my opinion is that that's quite worrying for me because I feel like the 10% triggers the arborist involvement as well a bit more, which also can, you know, in that case, the trees will be protected in a better way when, as soon as the arborist will go on site and assess the tree and, give evidence that, or provide as much evidence that the tree will remain viable. The 10% is still, it's still a guide, hence why I think it's still good to keep it there, because we do still let, further encroachment happening. But I feel like for developments and constructions, I feel like the developer easily could go even further than 20, and we can lose a little bit of that control over the impact of the trees, because even when there's 10, it's like, 15 or 20, and then maybe we go 30, and it's just a little bit, yeah, to me, it's a bit worrying, actually.
Yeah, thanks, Shane. I totally agree, and there seems to be lots of other people in the call that feel the same way. Yeah, it's a good point that the 10% also triggers an arborist to be involved. There are some council legislation or DCPs and documents that say if you've got a 10% encroachment, you need to have an arborist report, but or a minor encroachment, you need an arborist report. So there may be cases where we don't actually get involved for a minor encroachment, but it may actually be significant.
Yeah, because we're also categorizing it as minor encroachment up to 20% in that case, and that also is quite a lot of encroachment when you look at trees on development sites in certain aspects. So yeah,
absolutely. That might be a good segue for me to show the examples that I've drawn up. The draft standard has just recycled the 10% encroachment diagrams. I assume that updated diagrams will be done at some stage, but this is my working of 20% encroachment. So a straight encroachment for a tree of this size with 4.8 TPZ comes right up to the structural root zone. And for a right-angled encroachment, 20% is almost a quarter of the TPZ, so obviously it's coming close to taking up a quarter and well inside the structural root zone for that kind of encroachment. And then if you have it on two sides, it's getting quite close on two sides, which may, if you're just looking at a 12 times dBH, that might not actually be where the roots are, and all this might be important area. And again, similarly with the trench, that's against the structural root zone, but considered minor. We've got several other people with their hands up. I think Kane was first.
Yeah, just wanted to say that I think the NRA, whatever we're calling it now, ultimately, I think it's captured quite well the nominal root area. It is just a circle on a plan, and that doesn't actually mean a lot for city trees or anything in an urban environment, to be fair. And it's an easy way out for us to be able to calculate that based on an area. But as Peter has mentioned, and a few other people have mentioned, it doesn't account for where the roots actually are. So, 20%, 30%, 40%, 50, 60, in a tree in an urban environment is going in a planted pit. That 10% is kind of irrelevant, or 20. We're probably talking about it growing in a 10% volume. So it is on a case-by-case basis. I think to fall back in hearing from Shine there, it's perhaps a rewriting of triggering points in planning documents or other levers that should probably be pulled in that context. And just on that as well, there are some interesting tools that are out of America that actually allow you to, that's not a nominal root area, but apply a circular area in a space and then map out other areas to subtract from the 10% and see what you're left with. So if you have building footprints and that type of thing, you can actually sort of visualize where the roots are likely to be on that basis. So yeah, interesting things in this space too.
Cool, thanks, Kane. Okay. lost the queue of questions. Who was the next? Ian?
Thanks, Jackie. I just wanted to say something about the new terminology of nominal root area and tree protection area. I think we've taken 15 years to educate other disciplines about what TPZs are, tree protection zones, and we're still doing that. I'm a bit concerned about changing that terminology now, and I suspect that we'll still see tree protection zones used for some time. In the past, and I think at TreeNet, when there was a workshop on this a few years ago, it was suggested that we should have a notional or nominal tree protection zone, which would be the 12 times DBH, and a designated tree protection zone, which is the area designated for protection, i.e. to delineate between those two those two concepts. I'm wondering whether Peter knows or can say whether the committee had a look at those terms and whether it discussed the confusion that may arise from changing terms when we're still relatively new into this into tree protection. It's been 15 years, but we're still educating people about those terms.
Yeah, if I can just speak to that. The tree protection area, which is the area we need to fence off and protect. We did talk about, I think they originally wanted to put in designated that term was mentioned. Back at the NRA, the nominal root area, there was talk about theoretical root area, other terms, and we agreed on nominal as being probably the most appropriate term, but whether it's nominal protection zone, the problem with the starting point, that nominal area, if you like, if you use the word protection, it sort of brings up the idea that we're actually, the word protection, I don't think should be, it's an area required for the tree to stay viable. That's the general underlying sort of premise, but when you use protection in there, it sort of ties it into the actual application and where you're going to build. So I think the first point needs to not have the word protection in it, and then it comes in at the next stage when we're actually putting in our footprint and assessing, the amount of roots being cut. So, I'm not sure that NRA is going to get up. It might be too radical a change from TPZ, but we have to have, we need to split TPZ into different areas to define different things. We can't just have TPZ defining, the fenced area, because people say to you, how can we fence the TPZ and it's on the neighbour's property or across the road and all this sort of stuff. So, maybe those terms will be changed, but at this stage, that's what's in print. So see how many submissions come in asking for a change.
I think that's a good point about the root area. I think it might be, in order to reduce confusion, still have, instead of having tree protection area, retain tree protection zone.
Tree protection zone, as in that's the fenced area rather than tree protection area.
That's correct. Yep.
That could work. That could work.
Tend to agree with Melanie's suggestion of a nominal root zone. Possibly just to
rather than area.
Yeah.
Just drop the word area in both terms and use zone. So a nominal root zone and a tree protection zone. That sort of brings it back a little bit closer to where we're currently defining terms or having terms. So
I think it allows for the sort of flexibility, right?
Yeah, the zone, I suppose, is more than an area also, because it's the volume of soil beneath that area as well. So
that's true.
If you use the word zone, it's the two-dimensional or three-dimensional meaning, I suppose, as well.
And I think on construction sites, everyone is quite familiar with zones, exclusion zones, environmental protection zones, asset protection zones, which are used in planning and construction.
Yeah, so drop the term area on both of those terms and put it back to zone. It still has the same meaning and the same. It's defining the two terms better. So nominal root zone versus tree protection zone. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks, Melanie.
That, however, doesn't allow for protection of the canopy.
Yeah, I was going to mention that.
The tree protection
I think the
zone
definition
should include.
Took the words
Yeah, I
out of
think
my
it
mouth,
does.
Andrew. That was exactly what I put my hand up about. Was that
Me too.
It's in the definition. I think the
non-
definitions does
area, all
go
those
to.
don't account for the crown. Yeah.
Yeah, it is in the definitions and explanation of tree protection area.
Yeah, it is covered.
Adrian,
Does cover the crown.
do you want to move on to Adrian's question?
Oh, cool. Sorry, actually, just following on from that, the definition of tree protection zone, because in the old standard 3.3.1, that encroachment includes excavation, compacted fill, and machine trenching. I'm assuming, and I guess there's a question of generally the new standard revises that so that building over the notional root area is still counted as an encroachment. A couple of times in court, I had people sort of say, well, no, that's a suspended slab over the root zone. That's not an encroachment. And if you read it, by the letter of the standard, that they're right. However, if anyone walks under a bridge, there's nothing living there. So it's not just light, it's not just water, it's the soil biome and a viable soil biome that supports the tree and living. And just putting a bridge over the root zone doesn't necessarily mean it's protected. So it would be nice to confirm that the TPZ does, in fact, I know there is a definition that says 1 metre beyond the crown to protect the crown, but in terms of variate, like under that 3.3.1, it sort of misses that point. But look, part two is I also want to just express concern with the change from 10 to 20%. Deregulation in environmental protection is a scourge of economic socialism, and the more we deregulate expert involvement, the greater the damage to our natural resources. And it happens day in, day out, and it pains me to think that there is a changing of the gateway whereby anyone who is not qualified can not engage a consulting arborist who is an expert in this field to provide assessment of the specific tree, its age, its position, its location, all of those things under 3.4. That it doesn't mean we don't approve 20% encroachments. We do that, but we do that after making careful assessment using our expertise. I am really scared that 10%, say for a veteran or aging tree or significant tree of significant value, just gets wound up by some building designer, architect, engineer, unscrupulous developer just getting that extra 10% off something that can no way sustain that. So I don't know, that's my 2 cents, and hopefully that can be taken on board.
Thanks, Adrian. Great points. Peter, do you have anything?
Can I just? Yeah, I just wanted to just to not forget that if we're condemning these trees before the construction starts in our reports because there's a 20% encroachment, it does lead to more trees being cut down before the building even starts. We're not giving any additional chance for those trees to remain on those sites. We're actually condemning them as part of our assessment. So I think we need to keep that in mind. And I just want to also state how many trees you find that die on your construction sites that are marked there to be retained. It's very, very, very rarely that I've found any of the trees that are marked to be retained.
Yeah.
Some of them get bashed around, but they still survive. So I think we need to keep that in mind.
So I mean, like I might respond to that. Like we've had trees that die from 17% encroachment, and Andrew worked closely on that project, and tallow wood on a large long-term development site. You know, I've gone back and ground truth where clients have got a less reputable arborist to go and do an assessment and sign off to say that the 20% encroachment within Turpentine's root zones is sustainable, and gone there and just seen the I don't know 10 or so 50 mil woody roots that are just left open with an excavator having ripped and torn and shredded them. And so that it's okay. I don't think we're going to condemn trees necessarily if they're 20%, and I don't think that's necessarily the idea of the whole thing. I think like it's a more is more. I think is the idea, not less is more. Like, if we approach with caution rather than with gallant and bravado, like, yeah, we're fine with this. It's I think we know, we think we know it all, but we don't, like, and it's the 7 to 10 years time when we're not even involved anymore. And I know of other jobs where I've supported 20% encroachment on black butts, and I've gone back and seen them, and they're not very happy. There's diminishing vigor, dieback, dead wood, and these are large, 900 mil diameter to 1.2 diameter, part of blue gum high forest. And, I can ground truth and say that I've recommended those things, and it hasn't been a great outcome. So my caution comes with ground truthing and experience, I suppose.
Look, I'd like to say I do agree with Adrian about, and the other points that were made by some other people earlier, that the 10% shouldn't be thrown out the window. I do agree it's a good starting point, but it is also quite often possible to push to 20%, and it does come down to knowledge and experience, and the tree species itself, and also the management of the trees through the development, which is often the place where it falls down. So I don't think we should be letting people have a free run at trees up to 20%. Maybe the council or the initiation point is 10%, and an acceptable range is up to 20%. That's the key. It's an acceptable range depending on species and the type of development. So my point earlier was that I wasn't saying let's go for it and move it. I'm just saying it is possible. And one of the things I don't like is this ridiculous route mapping after 10%, which doesn't seem to be regulated in any way, and it's got no real point or purpose. Anyway, it is a good discussion, and there are some really great points, and I'm glad that having it.
Thanks, Hayden. I will just quickly go to Kat and Ian in a second. I just wanted to agree with Glenn's point. We're discussing the imaginary percentages that we're going to decide on, which is still a way of dealing with it, but the process is what's important. So it'd be great to have more guidance in the document about what process we do as consulting arborists or assessing arborists to assess the impact and decide whether that's justifiable or not. There is a bit more in the slides and the changes that I'd like to get to. So does anyone have, raise your hand if you need to go right on 11, and I'll try and we'll get to the questions and then wrap up. Okay, doesn't seem like anyone's in a rush. So Kat, do you want to go ahead?
Oh, thanks, Jackie. So one thing I wanted to point out was the clause 334 of the standard actually allows for arborists to make that call on whether a percentage encroachment is acceptable or not, and they can demonstrate it either by route mapping or whatever. But it's the most overlooked section of the standard in reports. It's a very frustrating thing to come across. But I've often supported 20% encroachments, and they've been fine. I've supported encroachments beyond 20%. For whatever reason, it could be the topography, the type of encroachment, and so on. But the 10% rule is very restrictive, very, very difficult to achieve on most urban sites. And I think the trouble with the 20% one is that even though the arborist certainly has the final say in things, architects, developers and so on, if it's 10%, they'll push for more. If it's 20%, they'll push for more. So as far as I'm concerned, 10% is too low, but I think 20% is too high a starting point. And realistically, I think, say, even 15% would be a good minor starting point to work from, and supported by clause 334, for example. And, 15% might be too much for a big old veteran tree, but 15% or 20% or even 25% for a very young, vigorous tree with the space to mature is quite supportable.
Thanks, Kat. I know that in the American system, they use different TPZ calculations depending on the species tolerance to development and the age of the tree. I don't think in Australia we have the data to do things that way, but different trees need different things. Ian, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I think, and thanks, Jackie. Adding to that, it's also the health of the individual tree at the time will make a lot of difference, and rainfall prior and during the construction period will make difference. I guess we need to recognise that the 12 times DBH for your TPZ at the moment has already been a compromise. We know that we're not encapsulating the whole root area within that 12 times, so we've already got minor encroachment of a root zone anyway. The 10%, or 20% shouldn't be a trigger to remove a tree because you're going to go greater than that encroachment. It's what triggers the detailed consideration by the arborist, by the project arborist. And I think that's, we need to be really careful. I think that people who use 10% or be it 20% as an excuse to remove trees for development, I don't think that's what the standard's trying to achieve at all. I think also sometimes there will be an encroachment, there will be an impact on a tree's health. Its useful life expectancy will be reduced, maybe from 15 to 40 to a 5 to 15 year UL, but that doesn't mean we should be removing it necessarily just because its viability has been impacted. That means that we need to recognise that and probably compensate it for it in some other way. But a tree that's going to last for 5 to 15 years is still worth retaining a lot of the time. The other point I just wanted to make about root mapping, and I think I've seen far too many times where the requirement for root mapping has actually impacted, the excavation for the root mapping has actually had more impact on the tree than what was warranted in the first place. And the only time we really should be root mapping is when there's an issue about structural anchorage stability issue. We know as arborists, if we're going to put a building over the tree protection zone over the absorptive roots, that it's going to affect the health. And we don't need to do root mapping to actually identify that. It should be about the structural root zone, not broader than that.
Thanks, Ian.
Yeah, good point. Good point, Ian.
Glenn, I think you were next.
Thanks, Jackie, and everyone. I just wanted to raise, with this discussion of 10, 20%, the consideration that we're all sitting here, most of us, I think, as consulting arborists, we've all got a lot of experience in this field with trees on development sites. We all know what we're talking about. We probably all know if 20% is too much or if it's not enough, or 15% is okay. But we also need to consider that this Australian standard is going to be predominantly used by people who are not consulting arborists and don't have our experience and our background. And for that purpose, I think all of this discussion, as I said before in the chat, talking about 10%, talking about 20% is all imaginary numbers that we're discussing. And every tree is different. There is a percentage of actual root encroachment that is too much and is not too much. imagining numbers like 10 or 20% isn't going to impact that. I think what we need to look at is that the Australian standard strengthens the actual process that is required to ensure that the project arborist is involved and is making these decisions on the development project. For that reason, I would like probably to see the trigger point left at 10%, to trigger that early, but for the wording in the standard to be changed and strengthened to really reinforce the process rather than, like everyone has said, a tree shouldn't be condemned at 11%. A tree shouldn't be condemned at 11%. Therefore, we just change the standard to strengthen the actual process that's required, and then project arborists can make those judgments up to 20 or whatever is required. And I would also just plus one what Ian said about the route mapping being really pertinent for structural issues rather than liability. Thank you.
Thanks, Glenn. Great points. I think I've noticed various, as I was going through the draft standard and other country standards, the British and Americans have quite a clear process of, particularly the British standard has a clear process of what the arborist needs to do and consider, and some guidance about how to do that. I'd like to see a bit more guidance for, as you said, people who aren't necessarily arborists to apply the standard. Rob?
Jackie,
Oh, sorry.
would you mind, after Rob, would you mind talking to this slide that's up, because it's very important, 24 versus 38.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Will do.
Thanks. Yeah, I'd just like to add, I agree with a lot of the comments that were said there. Just going back to tree protection zone and tree protection area is something that I've used for a long time, and I really like the way it is something significantly different to what the TPZ has been, because it is ultimately something that might be a far different shape to that of anything relating to the roots or the tree, and sometimes it's not even able to be fenced, but it doesn't mean that it shouldn't be a tree protection area when you start talking about some of those cantilevered slabs and things like that. What I'm hearing is that basically we have this problem sort of between minor encroachment and major encroachment. I've always had a fairly big problem that there's this sort of black and white line that suddenly something goes from a major encroachment to a minor encroachment. I'm wondering if, based on what I'm hearing from everybody, that there's not a real need for a third definition, that, you know, there's almost an acceptable encroachment or something, and then we start talking about encroachments between 10 and 20, where you must have, you know, input and advice from a consulting arborist, and where you do consider all those other things that everyone's been raising, and that then you have the line in the sand, perhaps at 20%, that it becomes, you must really justify what's going to go on beyond that. But having this really simple one definition is missing the point of this grey area. It's a bit like, you know, QTRA. You have broadly acceptable, which is at one end, you have wildly unacceptable at the other end, and the value of QTRA is that, you know, it's about somebody applying all of the measures and checks and balances for that middle area. And I think the standard misses what needs to happen in this middle area, and that it should be a range. I've always had a problem that people start giving you grief over a 12% incursion versus a 10% incursion. And it should be, you are listened to as an arborist when you're starting to argue with council officers or whatever, where they say, 12% is over the allowable amount. Well, then there should be something in the standard that starts to really convey that there's this middle ground where arborists need to be involved and make judgment calls.
Yep, thanks, Rob. Definitely agree. There's the value that comes from arborists is to apply their knowledge to figure out that grey area. There have been a couple. I'll just change slides and come back to this one. There are a couple of suggested ways of doing that from Greg Moore at TreeNet in 2018, which was only 9 years after the standard. And Guy Prosin has our honorary life member, Guy Prosin, has his method that he's used for many years. So ranges of, defining the ranges of encroachments, less than 10%, 10 to 20, 20 to 30, and over 30 is Greg Moore's suggestions and some guidance around what happens with those trigger points. And Guy Prosin has just given them names to refer to, and I think he gives more definition about what those names refer to. Was there anything else on that point before I move on?
Can I just say that those percentages, Jackie, relate to nominal root areas, not actual. Still, so
Yes, that was
yeah. So that's where it gets confused. Where you've got a complicated site that's built out on 3 sides, you'll never comply with even 35% if you're going to try and retain a large tree. So maybe if you go back to your previous slide and just talk us through the difference between notional and actual, and where you end up with the percentages. Thanks.
Danny, did you have something on that point before we go back to that one?
Well, just the idea that from the 10%, if we retained the 10% and we had the grey area where, of course, depending on the age of the tree, the tolerance of the species, which we did try to put in the first standard, but it was a little bit too complex. So it was the idea was to simplify it to what we got, because we didn't have the knowledge, and we thought a lot of people wouldn't have the skill set to do it. So we kept it very simple. That's why we left that out about the tolerance of trees. And but with our own expertise, I think that is quite viable. That, as Peter said quite frequently, that there are a lot of people who don't have that skill set and who would be using the standard all over Australia. So, but as I said previously in my note to the comment section, I think if you were going to go from 10 and then you wanted to encroach to 20, maybe we've never set where root mapping is required, and maybe root mapping is required at 20%. And that way you justify, you go from 10 to 20, you have it at 10, you encroach to 20 by arguing whether the tree is tolerable, it can tolerate the encroachment or not. But once you get to 20%, that's your trigger for root mapping. Then you've actually set a line in the sand for where root mapping is required, as opposed to this, 0.01% past 10%. It's just very arbitrary. But if we said, no, look, 20% is where we believe the line in the sand is for tree stability and viability, and you justify between 10 to 20 as to the tolerance of the tree, I just think if that was put in the standard, then that would give us a lot, greater reason to encroach. And then once you did your root mapping at 20, if there were no roots, then of course on the other basis, like from the other methods that are out there, then you might encroach even further. And again, root mapping, if you find there's absolutely nothing there, then depending on the viability and stability of the tree, that it may be a feasible option. So just thinking that these are, because we don't have a trigger for root mapping, and it's always been annoying because it was actually said that it's just past 10. That was never the intention. That was never the intention in the standard the first time. But if we put a trigger in now, then if we leave it at 10, like a lot of us have discussed, but if on your way to encroaching past 10, if we say the trigger is at 20, because we know a lot of trees are tolerant, then that might be a good way to let people know that is the line in the sand. So,
Danny, could I just jump in on root mapping? Like, if I was to just vaguely consider the number of times where I've actually thought that root mapping was actually appropriate, and say it was probably 5% of cases. Like, I know, and a lot of people have already talked about today, saying that they think that root mapping actually causes the tree more harm than the actual end up development in the first place. Like, why is route mapping such a high, like it's not essential. A lot of councils are treating it as essential and the only way you can justify. There's 9 or 10 other items there that can be used. And it says it should. It doesn't say we must use route mapping.
No, I agree.
Like putting a trigger when route mapping must be required, we're creating an environment where route mapping is now an essential part of every assessment if you reach that threshold, where it may not actually be required. And it's hideously expensive. It's going to create more tree hate. People are just going to remove trees before going down the road of, and we see it so much. Like the second survey being done with the old trees removed. It's like route mapping. It's just like putting a measure in there when it is required. I disagree with that entirely. Like I think it's one of the methods that can be used in certain circumstances, not the ultimate one.
I guess, Adrian, what I was thinking was, with your example for the turpentine was, if you encroach that far towards the tree, then what you were saying before about that turpentine, then you would have known. I mean, arguably, all we're trying to find out with route mapping is where the roots are, right? So the structural roots. So, that turpentine you mentioned before, had they route mapped, in a sensitive way, they would have known those roots were there rather than ripping them out with the excavator.
Well, the thing is, though, that would be damaged at the point, because there's not many people can say they've seen the best route mapping example ever where the roots haven't been damaged by route mapping. Those roots would have been damaged at the point the developer wanted to damage the roots at, not the point that we say that the development should occur at. So the developer already gets the encroachment at the desired level, not at the point we're saying. So what we want is the encroachment at the point we say is sustainable and viable, not the point that they say. And seeing is what's happened is that they've gone and dug where they wanted to dig because they got someone to sign off to say that's okay, and the roots are just left hanging there, torn and shredded and damaged anyway. So it's not the I don't know.
I agree with. Like, I don't think it's the be all and end all, but I actually think, although it's been embraced strongly by local government, I actually think it came out of consultants saying this is what we've done to justify encroachment on behalf of our client. And I think that's where it started more than anything else.
Yeah. Look, and fair enough too. Like in some circumstances, you think, okay, well, in this circumstance, I feel that route mapping would be viable because we're disagreeing with what council is already pushing back to us on. And so we say, okay, well, to get through this disagreement, we believe that route mapping should be done in this location, and we're determining the location where the route mapping should be done, not the developer, the builder, the architect. It's something we're already supporting, and we're advising the client that we should do route mapping in this location. It's not being determined by an area that the developer is saying this is where we want to build to. We've already determined, the client's already listened to us. They're going, okay, we'll modify the development to this location. Council's saying, no, we don't want the development in that location. We've already said, no, we feel it's okay. So then, okay, let's do route mapping then. And, it's a different approach, I think.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree with you. I guess the problem, what we need is a really strong set of rules or definitions for how and when route mapping is done, as opposed to it arbitrarily being applied to the project. I mean, total agreements with you. We should be the ones who determine where it happens, and I think the standard, if possible, should be able to put this definition in there as to when and this process.
So we've got a job at the moment. At this point, there's a 15-story building on top of it, and they want to put a 40-story building on top of it. Now the council has insisted on route mapping. Now, they're not demolishing the old building before they put the new building in. So the face of route mapping that we require is 3 metres under the existing footprint. But Cindy is absolutely insisting on undertaking route mapping. The only place we can undertake route mapping on 30-metre plane trees is 3 metres off the trunk. Of course we're going to find roots there. It's just absolutely ludicrous. Yeah. And actually, do you know what? That's actually coming through Land Environment Court as well. So it's gone from Sydney, and it's now being supported by the courts, and it's actually a court-required aspect to go to the next stage. And no amount of explaining can change it.
see, could I just jump in there also? What's probably needed in this standard is either a normative or an informative section at the back on route mapping, because no route map that I've ever seen talks about what routes have been retained. You get trees that have got 6 buttresses being retained and possibly one that might be impacted, and there's no discussion about, well, how does retaining 6, 1 out of 7 impact the stability of the tree, and is cutting 200 diameter roots the same as cutting 600 mil diameter roots? There's no discussion about what the conclusions are from the findings. There needs to be some document prepared that actually defines why, how, and when we do route mapping. I think it's something that needs to be written. But my point, I think route mapping should be done when there's works within the SRZ. That's my opinion.
See, I think if you do route mapping in SRZ, you're guaranteed to find routes. And that's my experience. When we've done route mapping in a structural route zone, you find a stack of structural routes. Like that out of all the zones, that's the least nominal out of all of them. And this, if we talk to the idea of nominal, we're protecting the area within our site, and we firmly recognise that neighbouring sites cannot protect their portions of the TPZs they may have already developed there. So that's where this nominal route zone is so important, because we're protecting the bit we can protect, recognising that in all likelihood there's going to be more percentages taken over the boundary by other developments adjacent. So I put in the comments there about I'm happy to use imaginary numbers, because the thing is, when someone else chops off the routes that we can't protect, at least we've got contiguous route zone within our property that we can protect to protect them. So I think it's scary to talk about how nominal things are. We know that trees need this volume, and the talking about nominal and imaginary, and maybe there are roots there, maybe there aren't, only breeds more route mapping, which breeds more damage to the trees. So I'm happy to, like I said, I'm happy to use imaginary numbers. I'm happy to use an arbitrary circle, and I'm happy to assume that there may or may not be roots there, but it's for a bloody good reason, I think. So.
Thanks, Adrian. Margot, would you like?
Just really quickly, I'd like to see the new standard have a much stronger focus on doing the preliminary arboricultural report. So what we're talking about is hopefully that could be identified way earlier. I find that, the one little paragraph in the current standard where it talks about that is pretty weak, and people just don't see it. So all this discussion that we're having now about, encroachment, route mapping, etc., is, I just think that it'd be way better if the arborists could get in earlier. Now, I've experienced the project arborist and the AIA reports. Normally we do come in after the design's been evaluated, drawn up by the architects, etc. But yeah, I just find that this would be possibly a strengthening of what we do as arborists.
Yep, good point, Margot, thanks. Danny, I'll take your question and then I'll explain this diagram.
Oh, sorry, I still had the hand up, sorry.
Okay, so the draft standard calculates encroachments on the nominal root area and not the adjusted tree protection area. So that's one thing that I believe needs to be changed before it's approved. The nominal 12 times dBH area in this example and a 2 metre deep excavation for absorption trenches here. By nominal 12 times dBH, it's a 24% encroachment over here, but from knowing that this is a road and there's generally not good conditions for root growth under roads, and this area has all been grass and garden before, I applied a modified TPZ of the same square meterage and used that modified TPZ to calculate the encroachment of those two absorption trenches, and actually found that it comes out as 38% of the likely area that the roots are. So if we were to change to a 20% trigger point, this would be seen as only just over the acceptable encroachment, whereas the likely actual impact is almost 40%, which is going to have much more of an impact. And in this case, where there was driveways, stormwater, existing damage, retaining walls, the trees have only got this tiny space left to grow, and not even a full structural root system. So yeah, I think a definite requirement is that encroachment should be the TPZ or TPA that the arborist has assessed to be actually the case, or likely the case, whether that's through their expertise or route mapping or other justifications. So yeah, that's kind of a comment on the change to 20%, and also the use of the nominal root zone instead of the TPZ.
Yeah, can I just jump in there, Jackie? That's really good. And you will get much more challenging situations than just a road on one side where you've got a tree in a rear garden on a site that's been built out on three sides in, say, the last 20 years. So you'll end up with massive, actual encroachments or modified encroachments, if you like. So to justify those, you won't, you're dealing with big numbers and trying to convince someone that that tree should be left and managed. So, but this is the crux of the whole matter that isn't discussed and isn't in the standard, and what we try to do when we're doing our impact assessment. So whether we try and get a diagram in the standard or something like this, but there are other situations more challenging than this, and that's where the route mapping comes in. Do you route map along the back boundary of the neighbour to see whether the footing of their wall has confined roots? You've made an assumption here that the carriageway has confined roots 100%. That's fine, but what about the neighbours on either side as well? So it's a difficult process. The crux of the matter. So in this situation, you would be suggesting that either the building or the absorption trench can't be there, or what are you concluding from this?
If I had the chance to modify the design, I would say don't put the absorption trenches there, find another stormwater alternative. Unfortunately, this was a complying development approved development, so everything's more than 3 metres away from the trees, and they can do whatever they like. So I don't think those trees are viable. But I don't know. I guess route mapping in this situation where you know that they're not going to have a good chance anyway, route mapping along that edge of proposed excavation could show yes or no there are a huge amount of structural roots, a huge amount of feeder roots that are going to be damaged, and therefore yes, there's no saving them, or miraculously they don't have any roots in that area. But ideally you get involved at the actual design stage, not these trees are a problem, come and help me stage. Danny?
I know, I was just going to say, I agree with what Peter was saying. I think we do need probably a better range of diagrams, normative diagrams in the rear of the standard, just to come up with, to guide people as to likely encroachments or constraints to tree protection areas that exist. So yeah, I think what you were saying, Pete, you've said a few times now, I think that would be really helpful. Just a few more diagrams perhaps of scenarios that are fairly common.
Yeah, I like what you've said there, Jackie. You've called it a modified tree protection zone, but using the words actual expected root zone. So there's still no certainty about where everything is in reality, but you can make some judgment on if you've got information about existing structures and where rock is on the site. So,
and Peter, do you know how the diagrams are dealt with? Was that going to be covered at a later stage?
It's a bit problematic. Yeah, there is a new drawing in there which got some colour in it, but it's actually got the wrong. It's got tree protection area instead of nominal root area in the notes. So, but it was problematic getting that out of standards. They said they were going to do it ages and ages ago, and then it's finally appeared, and it's still wrong. So, but obviously you've got the skill to produce a drawing like that. Whether we just offer to do it for standards, but I can look into that and see whether or not we can provide a drawing that could be inserted as an extra drawing.
Thanks. Was there someone else with their hand up, or has that question been answered? Okay. I'll just see what else we had. So I did a bit of a comparison to the other standards around the world. Didn't get a chance to look at the European ones. I think they've recently been preparing standards, but they're not available yet. The US has the ANSI, and I believe the BMP from IACA feeds into that. I've only got access to the BMP at the moment, so that's what I've reviewed. And then the British standard, which one of the points I noticed was that the draft standard now doesn't reference the British standard, but I believe it seems like there's still quite a lot of overlap, and our standard probably is quite closely aligned with the British standard.
I'm not sure why that was discussed. I can't quite recall the reasoning why we would drop that. Maybe it's because things have moved on, but I agree that our standard does mirror the British more than any of the others, I think. So maybe that can be put back in the referenced documents, but it was discussed that we would drop that out. So maybe it should go back in.
And I know that the British standard was created updated 3 years after our original standard. So there might be some updated information in that one since ours was created, but they also did a public exhibition in 2022, but that doesn't seem to have gone far, or I can't find any information about it. But just some comparisons between the wording that different standards use. So DBH is in the Australian and American versions, although Americans say 4.5 feet. British use stem diameter at 1.5. I think some council documents and other tree management documents use 1 metre or ground level to specify where the tree should be measured. I would hope that an updated standard would prompt councils to update their measurements so that it's a bit more standardised. TPZ is also similar to the United States version, although they use between a 6 times DBH and an 18 times DBH. So 18 is for older trees that are less tolerant or less tolerant of disturbance. The Brits use root protection area, 12 times diameter, the same as ours. And as per some of our discussion today, the tolerance could be, or the root zone actual location could be dependent on species and condition of the tree and how tolerant it is to disturbance. I can't find any other standard that has a calculated structural root zone. I know that the Americans, there are a couple of inquiries from American arborists recently trying to figure out how we'd gotten to the structural root zone. They don't have an agreed definition. They refer to a critical root zone, which was in the old British standard as well. Danny, do you have some input?
There has, yeah, thanks, Jackie. There has been controversy over the years as to how Matic got to his 10,000 trees for the structural root zone of tree failures in storms. I know Dr. Duncan Slater hasn't been very happy about that. It's, you know, not really hidden his scientific displeasure to how that was arrived at, but which is possibly why other standards haven't adopted it. But we adopted it because it seemed current at the time, and we did like to have a baseline from which to draw those calculations. So I think it's worked pretty well. What do you think, Peter? Gasta?
Yeah, I think it's okay. The complicating thing is Matic described it as above root buttress, which in general forestry terms is DBH anyway. I use it for cutting out the unmerchantable timber out of the tree, but from that we've got these two measurements that most people do, one at DBH and one above the root buttress, and some people do it at ground level, some people do it, but I think it's, I just add 10% to the DBH with most trees unless it's a hills fig, in which case it's reversed. But Catrion's done a couple of studies as well, but that's classmatic, that's how we defined it. But I think the SOZ is, the way the formula works is quite good. But the other question is, why don't we have a similar formula for the TPZ? Why don't we have one that's a linear line and one that's a curvy sort of, whatever you call that, algorithm or whatever? It doesn't make sense. They should both be the same. Anyway, it's what I've got to say on that.
I think it's a bit hard in practice to make the TPZ on a calculation like the SRZ. I always use a calculator on my phone to do the SRZ. I don't know off the top of my head what an SRZ would be, apart from general gist of how big the SRZ might be, but if you change it from 12 times DBH to a whole formula, it might not be as easy to use on site.
Yeah, I can't see biologically why you couldn't have a 3 times trunk diameter for the SRZ. I don't know. I mean, that's classmatic has gone at us and we grabbed it.
I think there is,
but it does seem to.
In the American version standard, I think there's a mention of 3 times DBH for structural root zone. Or for
critical root zone, yeah.
Well, I think the Americans use height diameter ratio more as a structural root zone, so that's what they tend to use more frequently.
Okay. Kane?
Yeah, look, I just wanted to say that Wesley and Herb suggests that the cutting of doing roots less than 1.5 trunk diameter away from the trunk can lead to instability issues. So that's a reasonably new perspective out of Europe.
Who was that from, sorry?
It's Wesley and Herb. It's the tree statics and inspection manual.
Okay. Interesting, thanks. Going on with a few of the other comparisons, so the use of millimetres, centimetres and metres. In our standards we use a mix of everything. In my perspective, design and construction use millimetres and metres, they don't use centimetres. So I think Glenn has said that in the chat as well. The British standards use millimetres and metres. I think Americans only use centimetres because it's sort of close to the inches and they don't have an in-between or smaller unit of measurement. And I think it would be better to align with design use of terminology than forestry. I think forestry also uses centimetres. And then retention values. There was a little bit more coverage of retention values in our old Australian standard, but it wasn't defined. The current draft has some clause about the arborist choose which retention value method they use, and it's not defined in the standard what those might be. But the American and British do have suggested ways of categorising the trees to decide their suitability for retention or preservation, as they say in America. So the US has 3 different options: low, medium, high, 0 to 5 rating, which could also be the way that I do it is low to medium, medium to high, and high, or 0 to 100%, which is a bit more subjective, I guess, how that's applied. And the British is similar to the STARS, IACA STARS method, A, B, C rated trees, and U is unsuitable, which I think is basically the same categories as the STARS. And so age classes and estimated life expectancy, these are not defined in our standards. The Americans do, they conflate age classes and life expectancy as a percentage, and so young is, I think, less than 20% of its lifespan, semi-mature is 40%, old is more than 80%, and the British have young, semi-mature, early mature, mature and over-mature, and a separate estimated remaining contribution of less than 10 years, 10 plus, 20 plus and 40 plus years. So yeah, a few things that might be good to clarify or give guidance. Thanks, Glenys. I'll try to wrap up. I've actually probably only got the bits and pieces that were my other things that I'd noticed that had been changed or that I suggest could be put in. So this is not Peter's perspective. This is just some things that I've noticed, and it's not from standards or IACA. It's just a few other things. The wording determining authorities changed to relevant authority. I think that's a better use of terminology. It's not necessarily determining anything. They could be giving orders like a court, so relevant authority makes sense. Bigger is changed to health. Some concerning changes that I find is that only trees to be retained are shown on a preliminary arboriculture report. This seems to me to be putting the cart before the horse. You haven't done the impact assessment, so how can you say which trees are being retained? And the wording has changed for the AIA to discuss the most likely impacts on trees to be retained, whereas previously it said identify trees to be removed, retained and transplanted, and identify the possible impacts. So I think the process that most of us probably use is you have a look at the whole situation, what are the possible impacts, and rule those in or out. Don't just concentrate on the most likely and ignore the rest. Peter, if you wanted to jump in at any of these points, let me know.
Yeah, the bit on the preliminary report, trees to be retained, that's not right. That needs to be changed if that's what it says. So we'll comment on that.
Yeah, I think there's seems to have been minor wording changes that are not really noticeable if you're comparing one to the other, but reading them in the new draft in detail, seems like some of the original intent has been misunderstood and rewritten to end up changing what was intended. Tree protection fencing posts are recommended to be driven into the ground 600 millimetres in a tree protection zone. Previous standard didn't say that, didn't recommend driving posts into the ground, and it did say to be located clear of roots, which is no longer in it. The new draft has removed temporary root protection and just says backfill as quickly as possible. In reality, that could be months or weeks. It has removed maintained TPZ specifications for mulching, watering and weed removal. So some of the discussions today have been that we should have more guidance about that kind of thing, remediating and improving tree health, so taking out detail that could be useful to users of the standard. I think that should be put back in and maybe even added to. And I wasn't sure about this point. Stump grinding is preferable to digging out stumps. I would have thought it would be the other way around, or to not take the stumps out and leave them there if that's not going to get in the way of anything. I don't know if anyone has perspectives on that. Danny? Yep.
Yeah, regarding the stumps, I think it always depends how close one tree is to another, I think, you know, or if they're grafted, or if they're likely to be the same species and their roots are grafted, or just proximity. I mean, you know, if one tree's a long way away from another, it's unlikely to have an impact. But if it's really pretty close, I think that's where it needs to be considered.
Yeah, maybe just some clarification of the wording that stump grinding may be an encroachment to other existing trees if...
Yeah, nearby the word could be nearby, perhaps.
And then a couple of things that I feel should be added or adjusted. I think this was possibly intentional, that economic or financial value of trees is left out. Even in the introduction, just in general terms, trees are financially valuable. I think the British or the American, must be the American, does cover financial value of trees. It's worth noting, not that we're going to apply a certain value, because the standards didn't really work out for that topic, but I think it's worth pointing out. British standard clarity in some parts could be improved and give more guidance. So I think Peter has this is intended to be clear in the draft, but I'm not sure that it has been fully sort of detailed, that the concept tree protection plan for getting approval for works is different to a construction stage tree protection plan. And only showing retained trees. Might be putting the cart before the horse. And a big point that I don't see anywhere in the draft standard or the old standard is that the impact assessment needs to justify trees recommended or proposed for removal, what alternatives were investigated and ruled out. And in my opinion, Table 1 could be separated out into an overview of the process and then some details of what needs to happen at each step. We've talked about diameter above root buttress, and overall should be a clear guide based on particularly IACA and other people who deal with the standard every day, what our best practice is that we apply, and try to clarify that to other users of the standard, so that we can all be implementing the best practices that a lot of us have individually or collectively come up with. Chantal?
I just wanted to, we kind of touched on it earlier, but then it went away just with the nominal root area term. I really feel like we're not capturing canopies at all now, like before we could kind of incorporate in. And even when it talks about the crown stuff in the draft, it really says it just to be dealt with in the tree protection plan and the tree protection area, which is too late if you're taking out 50% of the canopy for trees to be retained. So just one thing that I kind of felt like we touched on and then it didn't get moved on. So.
Good point. Yeah, I noticed that as well, that the preliminary or the design stage doesn't really consider pruning that might be needed or the impact on crowns and above ground parts of the tree, so that might be something where additional guidance could be added to.
Thanks, Jackie.
Okay, Glenn, go ahead.
Not sure if this is the right time and place to drop this in, but one thing I haven't seen addressed, and I'm not actually sure if the standard can fix the problem, but it's the issue of when you have a tree close to a boundary or maybe more than one property, how a development could arguably encroach 15% and the tree remain viable and the development be approved. But that may well then trap the owner of the tree on their property that they can't further develop or encroach within that TPZ of that tree. Not a simple I can't think of a simple resolution for that issue, and obviously over time it changes, but for two developments that are happening at the same, reasonably close together, I don't know how the standard would address it, but it's something that could be addressed. It's something that we need to consider and resolve.
Great point. Yeah, I've had a site where one building I was called in later in the process to be the project arborist, and a development had just been finished in the neighbouring property. The tree was in my client's property, and the encroachments had been deemed acceptable, about 20% or so, and 3 metres off the trunk of a large eucalypt, but next door had excavated for their alfresco area and drainage, and that was also about 20 or 30% encroachment, and the arborist that was writing both the AIAs was actually working on both of those properties, so should have applied the total encroachment. So yeah, I think some guidance around that would definitely help.
Thanks, Jackie. Glenn, that just made me think about it's not so much an AS issue, but a landscape issue, and that is these big developments putting in their proposed trees, which ultimately put the onus of protecting the root zone of those trees on adjoining sites. Similar sort of thing. It's putting the onus on the adjoining property to protect the tree, basically. So it's something really has to be considered when doing these impact assessments. I mean, as an arborist, if you're seeing that on the landscape plan, you should be raising that issue as well. So I just thought I'd mention that. It's not the standard, but yeah, it just, when you said that. I have one at the moment that's had 2 approved developments now on 2 sides of a very big heritage camphor. Those encroachments come up to about 50% now, and now the site adjoining the tree on the other side is submitting a multi-residential DA. How do we protect this tree? It's already had too much approved in its root zone. So, and now it's going on the other side. I'm saying, well, no, sorry, you can't excavate right up to the back of this site because of the next door tree and what's happened to it. So these sorts of zonings that allow this multi-residential thing need to be looked at too, not as a sort of overarching approach to it, because each individual development is just taking this root zone away from this tree. So
Sorry, Jackie, could I ask Peter if there's been any discussion regarding that boundary issue with the Australian standard, and whether there could be something put in the Australian standard about whether the tree is on the property of the development, etc.
I don't think.
clause 3.3.4 is where it's basically telling you as an arborist that you have to look at what's occurred on the other side.
Yeah, but if the tree's on your property, but the neighbours, if the proposed development is not on the same property as the tree, they could be landlocking the owner of the tree to not being able to do development on their property.
Yeah, that's true. There wasn't any discussion on that, and it probably needs to go into 3.3.4. There have been 2 or 3 changes in that section, things to consider. But this is a fundamental problem in infill areas, so maybe that should get noted down as an addition to that section, or even further up in the forward or something or other. You know, it's a problem, but yeah, I don't know what to do.
But perhaps just a way of thinking and a way of thinking that might lead to the solution is if we look at a 10% encroachment, 10 to 20, whatever we talk about. But if you imagine a site like out this way, like Riverston, where it's all paddocks, and then you're going to start putting houses all the way through it. If you look at a development and you're chewing up 10% of the TPZ, or 15% of the TPZ, but the tree's on another property, that perhaps there's less flexibility to go over 10% if the tree's not in your property. So that at least gives, you could then say, okay, well, yes, of course we could tolerate, that tree could tolerate 18%, but it's not on our property. The owner of the property allow for future development. So, you know, this is not an answer to the problem, but it's just a way of thinking that you would be less flexible to go over the 10% if the tree's not on the property of the development. Food for thought.
Yeah. And it's difficult to know when you walk onto a site the age of the recent works that have happened next door. They might look 10 years old, but they might in fact be 20. You know, you don't know. I mean, you could have a range of works adjacent within the TPZ, and at what stage do they become irrelevant because roots have regrown into those spaces? You know, it's a difficult one, but it needs to be acknowledged. It should be in 3.3.4 if it's not already there. It probably is, but maybe it needs to be fleshed out because it's fundamentally a problem.
Thanks, guys. We do have quite a few guests and council arborists here. I wonder if anyone has a perspective on how councils deal with that situation of a trees TPZ covering multiple properties and multiple encroachments happening. If anyone has any thoughts. Otherwise,
the other issue is, sorry, Jackie, to interrupt. There's no discussion about shared root zones when you get a cluster of trees and all the TPZs overlap. There's no discussion. There's no information in there about how you assess those situations. There's got to be some acknowledgement of that. All our trees aren't freestanding with, unconfined TPZs. They often overlap. So, we just use our judgment, I suppose, to make an assessment. But it's an important thing.
Question from Sophie: how much weight does development industry have on the standard review, Peter? Is there anyone representing developers? Or?
I don't think in the current printed standard there was all sorts of authorities who apparently were contributing to the process, but they don't actually contribute, but they have veto rights over it. we only have one, I think, the utility arborist represented, but he's a Gibson, I think he's Essential Energy employee. But yeah, I think they just have UDIA is certainly don't have the same sort of feelings about tree protection as we do, because it's a red tape problem for them, and state government seems to be moving in that direction to make it harder for us to protect trees. So I think that's the reality of where we're heading with a growing population. So our job's not going to get any easier. There was some discussions with UDIA some time ago. I can't remember on what forum it was, but it was a proposed review of something I can't remember now, but they were certainly anti any more green tape to constrain development in New South Wales anyway.
That was the place development, the place.
Oh, was it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. Thanks, Peter. Thanks everyone for all the input and questions. The standard commenting is open until 1st of August. I think IACA may put together a combined submission, but each person, any interested parties can put in comments by signing up for a free account with Standards Australia and comment on the different parts of the standard of the draft and wording what you support or what changes you would like, and we'll watch this space.
Yes, don't forget that it's the 1st of August when public review stops, so don't hesitate if it's fresh, do it now, just put a submission in. Whether or not they'll take more weight having come from an organisation or from individuals, but if there's multiple individuals with the same comment, I think it may well end up as a change to the current draft. So I encourage you all to jump on and just put your thoughts down while it's fresh. Thank you.
I'd just like to finish off by thanking you, Peter, and you, Jackie, for the presentation you've put together and for facilitating the discussion.